What would you do if one perfect day turned into a nightmare in just moments? Imagine this: a young girl, her heart filled with joy and pride, cruising the sunlit streets of her suburban neighborhood in her family's cherished car. A future so bright, it seemed unstoppable, until flashing lights in her rearview mirror brought her world to a screeching halt. This is the story of Maya Thompson, a girl whose only crime was celebrating her success, and Officer Lucas Wright, a man trapped in the shadows of his own bias. Their paths collide in a moment that reveals the unspoken truths of prejudice, humanity, and redemption. As lives intertwine, walls of mistrust begin to crumble, leaving behind lessons that will echo through their community and far beyond. Stay with us as we unravel this gripping tale of justice, courage, and transformation. A story that will inspire, provoke, and ultimately remind us of the power of change. The morning sun bathed the streets of Westchester County, New York, in a golden glow. Maya Thompson adjusted the rearview mirror of her mother's sleek silver Tesla Model S, the smooth hum of the electric engine soothing her as she cruised along the manicured streets. Her acceptance letter to Harvard sat neatly folded on the passenger seat, a testament to years of late-night study sessions and unwavering determination. "I did it," Maya whispered, a grin spreading across her face. At 18, she felt like she had the world at her feet. Her dark curls bounced as she bobbed her head to the upbeat rhythm of her favorite song, playing softly through the car's premium speakers. Her mind wandered to her mother, Captain Elaine Thompson of the NYPD, who had hugged her tightly the night before and said, "Take the car, celebrate, you've earned it." Maya's neighborhood was a picturesque paradise of sprawling homes with immaculate lawns and flower beds. Each house seemed to boast its own personality, and Maya couldn't help but dream of someday owning one herself. She imagined her future at Harvard, walking among ivy-covered buildings, forging lifelong friendships, and preparing to become a civil rights attorney. Her mother's dream for her, now her own. Maya's reverie was interrupted when she noticed a police cruiser idling at a cross street. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, this was a safe neighborhood, and her mother had always assured her that the police were there to protect and serve. The cruiser pulled out and began to follow her, its headlights reflecting off the Tesla's pristine silver exterior. Maya felt a slight pang of unease, but quickly brushed it aside. "They're just patrolling," she thought, focusing instead on the excitement bubbling inside her. But as she turned onto a quieter street, lined with cherry blossoms, the familiar wail of a police siren pierced the air. Her heart skipped a beat as red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Instinctively, she slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. "What's going on?" she whispered, her pulse quickening. She glanced around, hoping this was just a misunderstanding. Behind her, Officer Lucas Wright adjusted his sunglasses as he stepped out of the cruiser. His stern expression betrayed nothing but suspicion. Years of patrolling high-crime neighborhoods had left him jaded, his instinct often clouded by assumptions. And now, the sight of a young black girl behind the wheel of an expensive car triggered something he couldn't quite explain or control. Maya watched as the officer approached her window, his imposing figure casting a long shadow on the Tesla's gleaming surface. She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Always be respectful. Stay calm. Use your words." When the officer reached her window, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "License and registration," he barked, his hand resting on his holster. Maya's brow furrowed, but she quickly nodded reaching for her wallet and the glove compartment. "May I ask what I did wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Just hand over the documents," he snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. Maya hesitated for a moment before complying, handing him the requested items. She watched as he examined them, his eyes narrowing. "This car is registered to a Captain Elaine Thompson," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Care to explain that?" Maya took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "Yes, sir. Captain Thompson is my mother. She let me borrow the car to celebrate my college acceptance." Wright scoffed, the corners of his mouth twisting into a smirk. "Right. And I'm the Queen of England. Step out of the vehicle, miss." Maya's stomach sank. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. You can call my mother to verify," she pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. But Wright wasn't listening. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice rising. Maya complied, her legs feeling like jelly as she stepped onto the asphalt. The spring air, which had felt warm and inviting moments ago, now felt stifling. She stood tall, her chin held high, determined to maintain her dignity despite the growing humiliation. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," Wright ordered, his tone devoid of empathy. Maya froze. "Sir, please, do it now," he barked, cutting her off. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Slowly she turned and placed her hands on the cool metal of the Tesla's hood. As Wright cuffed her wrists, Maya felt a wave of shame wash over her. Passers-by began to slow their cars, their curious stares adding to her humiliation. She bit her lip, fighting back the urge to cry. Officer Wright stomped back to his cruiser, Maya's documents clenched tightly in his hand. Inside the Tesla, her phone buzzed with incoming messages, texts from her best friend Leah, who had been waiting to celebrate with her. Maya felt tears streaming down her face as she closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer. "Mom, please hurry," she thought, the words forming a lifeline in her mind. She could feel the weight of the handcuffs cutting into her wrists, a physical reminder of the indignity she was enduring. The street was eerily silent, save for the occasional whisper from passers-by, who had begun to gather at a distance. Maya Thompson stood with her hands cuffed behind her back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The warm sunlight that had felt so joyous just moments ago now seemed harsh and unforgiving. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to process how quickly her celebratory drive had spiraled into a humiliating ordeal. Officer Lucas Wright, meanwhile, sat in his patrol car, his lips pursed in a thin line as he examined the registration details for the sleek silver Tesla. His eyes scanned the name on the screen. Elaine Thompson, NYPD captain. "Yeah, right," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The name meant nothing to him at the moment. His instincts, sharpened or dulled by years of patrolling high-crime neighborhoods, told him that something wasn't adding up. Returning to Maya, Wright's demeanor remained rigid, his voice sharp. "So, you're telling me your mother just gave you this car to drive around?" "Yes, sir," Maya replied, her voice calm but tinged with desperation. "She let me borrow it to celebrate my college acceptance." "Convenient," Wright scoffed, stepping closer. "You expect me to believe that?" As Wright stared at Maya, his mind briefly wandered to a memory he thought he had buried. Years earlier, he had responded to a call about a stolen car in a different part of town. An incident that had ended in tragedy. The driver, a young black man, had panicked and tried to run. Shots were fired, and though Wright hadn't pulled the trigger, he had carried the weight of that night ever since. He justified his actions back then, telling himself he was simply doing his job. But deep down, he knew that the assumptions he had made in that moment had consequences he couldn't undo. Over time, those experiences hardened him, making him see threats where none existed, particularly when it came to young people of color. Now, as he looked at Maya, the edges of that old fear and bias crept back in, blinding him to the truth. The small crowd watching from across the street grew, their murmurs floating through the air. "Is that Captain Thompson's daughter?" one woman whispered to her friend, clutching her phone tightly as she recorded the scene. "It has to be. That's her car," the friend replied. "Why would they stop her? She's the captain's kid." Maya overheard snippets of their conversation, but it brought her no comfort. She felt every set of eyes on her, judging her, labeling her. "Officer, please," she said again, her voice trembling but firm. "If you just call my mother, she can explain everything." Wright sneered. "I don't need to call anyone. I know exactly what's going on here." His words landed like a slap, stinging Maya's pride. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Wright turned toward his patrol car, his radio crackling as he called for backup. "Dispatch, this is Officer Wright. I've got a possible stolen vehicle situation. Send a tow truck to my location." Maya's heart sank at his words. "No, you can't do that," she exclaimed, stepping forward instinctively before remembering the cuffs around her wrists. "Stay where you are," Wright barked, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The sharpness in his voice made Maya freeze, her breath hitching. "I'm telling you the truth," she said, her voice breaking. "This is my mother's car. She's Captain Elaine Thompson of the NYPD. Just check with her." Wright ignored her plea, focusing instead on the small crowd gathering nearby. "Move along, folks," he said loudly, waving them off. "Nothing to see here." But the onlookers didn't budge. Some continued recording, their faces reflecting a mix of concern and disbelief. Officer Sarah Martinez arrived at the scene in her own patrol car, stepping out cautiously. She was Wright's partner, a younger officer with a keen sense of duty but limited authority in their partnership. "Lucas," she said softly, her eyes darting between him and Maya. "What's going on here?" "I stopped this young lady driving a vehicle that doesn't belong to her," Wright replied curtly, handing her Maya's license and registration. Martinez glanced at the documents, her brow furrowing as she read the name. "Elaine Thompson. As in Captain Thompson?" "That's what she claims," Wright muttered. "Did you call her?" Martinez asked, her voice hesitant but probing. "I don't need to. I've seen this trick before. Borrowing cars, fake stories, it's all part of the game." Martinez hesitated, her instincts telling her something wasn't right. She glanced at Maya, who met her gaze with pleading eyes, but Martinez said nothing, fearing the consequences of challenging Wright in front of a growing audience. Maya, though terrified, found a surge of courage. She straightened her posture, looking directly at Wright. "Officer Wright," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "I know what you think of me, but I'm not a liar. I've worked hard my whole life to prove people like you wrong, and I'll prove you wrong today too. Call my mother." Wright's jaw tightened, but for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Maya!" Captain Elaine Thompson's voice rang out as she stepped out of her car, her badge glinting in the sunlight. Her presence commanded immediate attention, and the crowd parted to let her through. Elaine's eyes widened as she took in the sight of her daughter, handcuffed and standing next to her car. A wave of anger and disbelief washed over her. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. Officer Wright turned, his face paling as he recognized her. "Captain Thompson, I—" Elaine raised a hand, silencing him. "Uncuff her. Now." Wright hesitated, his pride warring with the gravity of his mistake. Finally, he fumbled for his keys, unlocking the cuffs with trembling hands. Maya rubbed her wrists, tears streaming down her face, as Elaine pulled her into a protective embrace. Elaine turned to Wright, her voice cold and cutting. "You have no idea who you've just humiliated. But you will. This isn't over." As Wright stood there, the weight of his actions beginning to dawn on him, Martinez looked on, torn between loyalty to her partner and a growing sense of moral obligation. Captain Elaine Thompson's commanding presence was palpable as she stared down Officer Lucas Wright. The murmurs of the crowd were now distant, replaced by the crackling tension between the two figures. "Officer Wright," Elaine began, her voice like ice, "you have a lot of explaining to do. But first, let me make something perfectly clear. This is my car, and that is my daughter. Now, tell me why she was cuffed on the side of the road, like a common criminal." Wright opened his mouth to speak, but faltered under Elaine's piercing gaze. He fumbled with his words, his earlier arrogance replaced with visible unease. "Captain Thompson," he stammered, "there was a misunderstanding. The car's registration clearly lists my name." Elaine interrupted, stepping closer. Her tone was calm but deadly. "Yet you chose to escalate rather than verify. Why is that, officer?" Wright glanced at his partner, Officer Sarah Martinez, but she avoided his gaze, shuffling nervously as she clutched Maya's documents. The ride to the precinct was tense. Elaine insisted on driving Maya herself, leaving Wright and Martinez to follow in their patrol car. Maya sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she replayed the incident in her mind. "Mom," she whispered, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry." "Stop," Elaine said firmly, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "You have nothing to apologize for. He does." Maya bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. "But I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking about all the stories we hear, and Elaine reached over, squeezing her daughter's hand briefly before returning it to the wheel. "You did everything right, Maya. This is on him, not you." As they pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Elaine exhaled sharply, preparing herself for the confrontation ahead. Inside the precinct, Elaine marched in with Maya by her side. The chatter among the officers died instantly, replaced by uneasy glances. Wright and Martinez trailed behind, Wright's face pale and Martinez's expression conflicted. "Sergeant Grant," Elaine barked, summoning the desk sergeant with a wave of her hand. Sergeant Grant, a seasoned officer with graying hair, approached cautiously. "Captain Thompson," he greeted, his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I want to file an immediate report," Elaine said, her voice firm. "An officer under your command unjustly detained my daughter. I expect full accountability." Grant's eyes widened as he looked at Wright, who was now visibly sweating. "I see. Let's step into my office." Elaine nodded, signaling Maya to stay put. "Wait here, sweetheart. I'll handle this." As Elaine and Grant disappeared into the office, Wright slumped into a chair near the front desk. Martinez stood nearby, clutching her radio as if it were a lifeline. "Lucas," she said quietly, "you should have called the captain when she told you to. This could have been avoided." Wright shot her a glare. "Don't start with me, Sarah. You think I don't know that now?" Martinez hesitated, then sat across from him. "I didn't agree with what you were doing back there. But you didn't stop me," Wright interrupted bitterly. So, don't act like you're above this. Martinez's expression hardened. Maybe I didn't stop you, but I'm not the one who cuffed an innocent teenager. You need to own up to this, Lucas. Wright didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the floor. In Grant's office, Elaine recounted the events with precision, her tone unwavering. Sergeant, this isn't just about my daughter, she concluded. This is about the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. If this were any other black teenager, would they have anyone to speak up for them? I will not let this slide. Grant nodded solemnly, jotting down notes. I understand, Captain. I'll initiate an internal review immediately. Officer Wright will be placed on temporary leave while we investigate. Good, Elaine said, rising from her seat. But know this, I'll be following every step of this investigation. If I sense even a hint of a cover-up, you'll be answering to more than just me. Grant swallowed hard. Understood, ma'am. Outside the office, Maya sat with her arms crossed, watching the officers around her with a wary eye. When Elaine emerged, Maya stood quickly, relief and apprehension mixing on her face. Let's go home, Elaine said gently, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. As they walked out, a few officers watched in silence, their expressions ranging from guilt to defensiveness. Maya felt their eyes on her, but refused to shrink under their scrutiny. Once they were outside, Maya turned to her mother. What happens now? Elaine sighed. Now we fight, not just for you, but for every kid who's ever been treated like this. Are you ready for that? Maya hesitated, then nodded. I am. Back in the precinct, Wright sat in the locker room, his head in his hands. The reality of his actions weighed heavily on him, and for the first time he questioned the decisions he had made, not just today, but throughout his career. Martinez entered, her expression unreadable. They're putting you on leave, she said softly. Wright nodded, not surprised. I screwed up, he admitted, his voice hollow. Yes, you did, Martinez replied. But what matters now is what you do next. Are you going to learn from this, or are you going to let it define you? Wright didn't respond, but her words lingered as he stared at his badge, lying on the bench beside him. That evening, Elaine and Maya sat on their couch, the day's events still fresh in their minds. Elaine poured them both cups of tea, her way of grounding them after a long day. Mom, Maya began, her voice soft. Do you think he'll change? Elaine considered the question carefully. I don't know, she admitted. But change doesn't happen overnight. It takes accountability, hard work, and a willingness to see the world differently. Maya sipped her tea, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what lay ahead. I want to help, she said finally. Elaine smiled, pride shining in her eyes. And you will. Together, we'll make sure this never happens again. The following morning, the peaceful hum of the Thompson household was shattered by the sound of Maya's phone, buzzing incessantly. Notifications poured in, each one lighting up the screen with messages, social media tags, and links to a video that had started to spread like wildfire. Maya opened the first notification cautiously. It was a text from her best friend, Leah. Maya, it's all over Twitter. Are you okay? Her stomach dropped. She clicked the attached link. There she was, in stark clarity, handcuffed, her face a mix of fear and humiliation, with Officer Wright looming over her. The video was just under a minute long, but it captured everything. The harsh commands, Maya's quiet pleas, and the murmurs of onlookers. Her heart pounded as she read the caption beneath the post. Another day, another case of blatant racial profiling. Justice for Maya, her end racial bias. By noon, the video had amassed hundreds of thousands of views. The hashtag's number sign, Justice for Maya, and number sign End Racial Bias trended across platforms, and users from all walks of life weighed in. Some expressed outrage and solidarity. This is why we need police reform now. Maya could have been my daughter. Heartbreaking. Others, however, were quick to defend Officer Wright. Maybe she looked suspicious. You can't blame the officer for doing his job. Bet this is blown out of proportion as usual. Maya sat on the living room couch, scrolling through the flood of comments. The support was overwhelming, but the negativity stung. "Mom," she called softly, her voice trembling. Elaine appeared, her expression calm but focused. She had already seen the video, having been alerted earlier that morning by her colleagues. "I know, baby," she said, sitting beside her. This was bound to happen. Maya's hands shook as she clutched her phone. "I don't want this. I didn't ask to be a hashtag." Elaine placed a steady hand on her daughter's shoulder. "No one asks for this, Maya. But this video is a wake-up call. People are paying attention. It's painful, but it's also an opportunity for change." At the precinct, Officer Lucas Wright sat in a dark corner of the break room, staring blankly at his phone. The video had reached him too, shared by an old academy classmate who captioned it with a single word: "Unbelievable." The comments online were relentless, tearing into him with ruthless precision. "This is the face of systemic racism. Fire this guy immediately." Wright's fingers hovered over the screen as he debated deleting his social media accounts entirely. The scrutiny was unbearable, and his family had already begun receiving calls, some supportive, others outright hostile. Officer Sarah Martinez entered the room, her face drawn with unease. "Wright," she began cautiously. "They're calling an emergency meeting." Wright nodded stiffly. "I figured." In the precinct's conference room, Captain Elaine Thompson sat at the head of the table. The tension was palpable as senior officers and department heads discussed the fallout. Deputy Commissioner Harris, a polished man in his late 50s, spoke first. "The video is a public relations disaster. We're seeing protests planned outside the precinct already. This needs to be addressed immediately." Elaine's voice cut through the murmurs. "We address it by holding ourselves accountable." Officer Wright's actions were indefensible. "We can't spin this." Harris frowned. "Accountability is one thing, Captain, but this department can't afford to lose public trust. We need to show we're taking action without throwing anyone under the bus." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "The public trust was lost the moment my daughter was cuffed without cause. If we want to rebuild it, we start by admitting our failures and making tangible changes." The room fell silent. By evening, protesters had gathered outside the NYPD precinct. The crowd was diverse, a tapestry of faces unified by a shared demand for justice. Hand-painted signs bore slogans like "Justice for Maya," "End Police Bias Now." Leah stood among them, her curly hair bouncing as she chanted alongside the crowd. She held a sign reading, "She's not just a hashtag." Reporters lined the streets, their cameras capturing the impassioned speeches from local activists. "This isn't just about Maya," one speaker declared. "This is about every black and brown child who has ever been treated like a suspect instead of a citizen." Maya watched the scene unfold from the safety of her living room, her mother beside her. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, tears in her eyes. Elaine wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "It's bigger than us now. But remember, Maya, you're not alone in this." At the precinct, Sarah Martinez wrestled with her conscience. She replayed the incident in her mind, haunted by the memory of Maya's tearful pleas. She approached Elaine's office hesitantly. "Captain, do you have a moment?" Elaine looked up, her expression curious but guarded. "Of course. Come in." Sarah sat down, fidgeting with her hands. "I need to tell you something about that day." Elaine leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "Go on." I I knew right was wrong," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking. "But I didn't say anything. I was afraid of what it might mean for my career, my reputation." Elaine's face softened slightly. "Sarah, recognizing your mistake is the first step. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" "I want to come forward," Sarah said firmly. "I want to help fix this." As the public outcry grew, Elaine agreed to a televised interview. Sitting opposite a seasoned journalist, she answered questions with poise and determination. "Captain Thompson," the journalist began, "as a member of the NYPD and the mother of the victim in this case, how are you balancing these roles?" Elaine took a deep breath. "It's not easy, but I've spent my career fighting for justice, and that doesn't change just because this time it's personal. My priority is making sure this never happens again, to anyone." When asked about Officer Wright, she chose her words carefully. "He made a mistake, a grave one. But what matters now is whether he's willing to learn from it and be part of the solution." Maya, encouraged by Elaine, recorded a short video addressing the incident. Sitting in her bedroom, she spoke directly to the camera, her voice steady but emotional. "I didn't want to be a hashtag," she began, "but if sharing my story helps someone else, then I'm willing to speak out." She described her experience with honesty, her words resonating deeply with viewers. "This isn't just about me. It's about a system that needs to change, and I'm ready to be part of that change." The video garnered millions of views within hours, with celebrities and activists sharing it widely. Maya's courage became a rallying cry for the movement. At home, Wright watched Maya's video in silence. Her words struck a chord, forcing him to confront the prejudice that had shaped his actions. He turned to his wife, who sat beside him, her expression heavy with disappointment. "Lucas," she said quietly, "you need to make this right. Not just for her, but for yourself and for us." Wright nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. "I will." The sun blazed down on the crowded streets of New York, but the heat did nothing to deter the protesters. Chants of "Justice for Maya" and "End Racial Bias Now" echoed off the skyscrapers, growing louder with every passing hour. Maya stood on the balcony of her family's modest townhouse, gazing down at the sea of people carrying signs and banners. Her best friend Leah joined her, leaning on the railing with a solemn expression. "It's incredible," Leah said, her voice filled with awe. "They're all here because of you." Maya shook her head. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been in my shoes, or worse." Down below, a diverse coalition of community leaders, civil rights activists, and everyday citizens took turns speaking into a microphone set up on the steps of the courthouse. Their voices rang with passion, calling for immediate reforms to end systemic bias in law enforcement. Despite the overwhelming support, Maya felt a growing storm within her. At night, when the chants faded and the streets grew quiet, she was left with her own thoughts. The humiliation, the fear, it all played on a loop in her mind. One evening, she confided in her mother while they sat together on the living room couch. "Mom," Maya began hesitantly, "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Everyone's looking to me, but all I feel is tired." Elaine placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's knee. "It's okay to feel that way, Maya. No one expects you to have all the answers. What matters is that you're willing to stand up, even when it's hard. Maya nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. But what if I mess up? What if I say or do the wrong thing? Elaine's voice softened. You'll learn, and you have people who love you to help you through it. Across town, Officer Lucas Wright sat alone in his dimly lit apartment. His wife had taken their children to stay with her sister, unable to handle the constant barrage of angry phone calls and threats. Wright stared at his badge on the kitchen table. It felt heavier than ever. Memories of the arrest replayed in his mind, each moment stinging more than the last. He picked up his phone and hesitated before dialing a number. Captain Thompson, he said when the line connected. Elaine's voice was calm but firm. What is it, Wright? I need to fix this, he said, his voice cracking. I don't know where to start, but I can't keep living like this. There was a long pause before Elaine replied. If you're serious about change, meet me tomorrow morning at the precinct. We'll talk. As the days passed, the protests grew larger and more intense. The energy in the air was electric, a mixture of hope and anger. Outside the NYPD headquarters, activists erected a wall of voices, a temporary art installation displaying stories of individuals who had experienced racial profiling. Maya's story was among them, her words printed in bold letters. You didn't just handcuff me. You silenced my dignity. But I refused to stay silent. The installation drew national attention, with reporters flocking to document the powerful display. Maya visited the wall with Leah and her mother, running her fingers over the words. You're inspiring people, Leah said softly. Maya took a deep breath. I just hope it's enough to make a difference. The next morning, Officer Wright arrived at the precinct early, his nerves on edge. Captain Elaine Thompson greeted him with a measured nod and led him into her office. Let's get one thing straight, Elaine began, her tone serious. I'm giving you this chance because I believe in redemption, but it's up to you to earn it. Wright nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I understand. Elaine leaned forward. Start by acknowledging your mistakes, not just to me, but to Maya and to yourself. You need to confront the biases that led you here. Wright's jaw tightened, but he nodded again. I want to do better. I don't want my kids to grow up ashamed of me. Elaine studied him for a moment before standing. Then, let's begin. Elaine introduced Wright to Jordan Carter, a prominent civil rights lawyer who had agreed to assist with the department's reform efforts. Jordan wasted no time. Officer Wright, if you're serious about making amends, you'll need to participate in the bias training program we're implementing. And I don't mean just attending, I mean engaging, reflecting, and sharing your story. Wright hesitated. You want me to talk about what happened? Jordan's expression was firm, but understanding. People need to see that change is possible, even for someone who's made serious mistakes. Your journey could help others recognize their own biases. Meanwhile, Maya found herself invited to speak at a local community forum. Nervous but determined, she prepared a speech with Leah's help. Standing in front of a packed auditorium, Maya took a deep breath and began. I never imagined I'd be standing here, she said, her voice steady. What happened to me was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced. But it taught me something important. Silence won't protect us. Speaking out is the first step toward change. Her words resonated deeply, earning a standing ovation. For the first time since the incident, Maya felt a spark of hope. At the precinct, Wright attended his first bias training session. The room was filled with officers from various backgrounds, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. The instructor, a passionate advocate for racial equity, began with a simple question. How many of you have ever made an assumption about someone based on how they look? Wright hesitated before raising his hand. He was one of the few who did. As the session progressed, Wright found himself confronting uncomfortable truths about his upbringing, his career, and his worldview. By the end of the day, he felt both drained and determined to continue the work. The chapter closes with Maya and Elaine attending a candlelight vigil held in Maya's honor. The soft glow of hundreds of candles lit up the park, creating an atmosphere of solidarity and hope. As Maya stood beside her mother, surrounded by supporters, she realized something profound. Her pain had sparked a movement. Elaine leaned down to whisper in her ear, "This is just the beginning, Maya. Change is coming." Maya nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and determination. The precinct buzzed with the usual chaos, but in Captain Elaine Thompson's office, a quieter tension lingered. Officer Lucas Wright sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elaine raised an eyebrow. "To me or to Maya?" "To both of you," Wright admitted, his gaze fixed on the edge of her desk. "But mostly to her. I owe her that." Elaine leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. If you're serious, I'll arrange a meeting. But understand this, Maya doesn't owe you her forgiveness." Wright nodded solemnly. "I know." When Elaine approached Maya about the meeting, her daughter's reaction was mixed. "Why should I sit down with him?" Maya asked, crossing her arms as she paced the living room. "Because this isn't just about him," Elaine said gently. "It's about you too. Carrying anger like this, it'll weigh you down." Maya paused, looking out the window. "I don't think I can forgive him, Mom. Not yet." "You don't have to," Elaine assured her. "But facing him might help you heal." After a long silence, Maya finally nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. But only because I want him to see what his actions did to me." The next morning, Maya and Elaine arrived at a quiet conference room in the precinct. Wright was already there, his posture stiff and his face pale. He stood as they entered, but Maya ignored his outstretched hand, taking a seat with her arms crossed. The room felt heavy with unspoken words as Elaine began. "Officer Wright requested this meeting. Maya, the floor is yours if you want it." Maya hesitated before speaking, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength. "Do you know what it felt like to be handcuffed for no reason? To have people stare at me like I was a criminal?" Wright opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "You didn't just humiliate me. You made me feel invisible. Like my words didn't matter. Like I didn't matter." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "I'm a person, Officer Wright. I have dreams, a family who loves me, a future. But you didn't see any of that. You just saw my skin." Wright's hands trembled as he placed them flat on the table. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see you. I saw what I wanted to see, what my own biases told me to see. And I was wrong." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I can't undo what I did, Maya. But I can tell you that it's changed me. You've made me realize how much harm those biases can cause. And I'm sorry. For everything." The room fell silent as Maya studied him. "Sorry doesn't erase what happened," she said finally. "I know," Wright said quickly. "But I want to make it right, however I can, even if it takes the rest of my life." Maya leaned back in her chair, arms still crossed. "If you really mean that, prove it. Show me and everyone else that you're serious about changing." Wright nodded. "I will." I promise, Elaine stepped in, her voice steady. Change doesn't happen overnight, Officer Wright. It's a process, and it starts with action, not just words. Wright turned to Maya, his expression earnest. Thank you for giving me the chance to say this. It means more than you know. Maya didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Later that week, Wright took the first step in proving his commitment. Standing at the front of a packed community center, he addressed a crowd that included activists, local leaders, and Maya herself. What I did to Maya Thompson was wrong, he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. I let my biases guide my actions, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I'm here today because I want to be better, and I want to help others in law enforcement be better too. His speech was met with mixed reactions. Some clapped, others remained skeptical. But Maya noticed the sincerity in his voice. As the event ended, reporters flocked to Maya for her reaction. I'm not ready to forgive him yet, she said honestly. But I can see he's trying. And that's a start. Her words were broadcast nationwide, sparking further conversations about accountability and redemption. Back at the precinct, Wright threw himself into the department's new bias training program. He volunteered to mentor younger officers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Maya found her own way to channel her emotions. She began writing a blog about her experience, using her voice to advocate for systemic change. Her posts quickly gained traction, drawing support from across the country. One afternoon, Wright approached Elaine in the precinct's break room. Captain, he said hesitantly, do you think Maya will ever forgive me? Elaine set down her coffee. That's not for me to say. But forgiveness isn't the goal here. Growth is. Wright nodded, her words sinking in. The chapter ends with Maya sitting at her desk, reading through messages from strangers who had been inspired by her blog. One stood out, a young black girl thanking her for giving people like her hope. Maya smiled, feeling a small but powerful sense of purpose. She wasn't just healing. She was helping others heal too. The NYPD precinct buzzed with an unusual energy as Captain Elaine Thompson convened a department-wide meeting. Officers filled the room, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. At the front, Elaine stood tall, flanked by a presentation screen that read, Reforming Together, Building a Better Department. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter, she began, her voice steady. What happened to my daughter, Maya, was unacceptable. But it's not just about her. It's about every individual who has ever been judged unfairly. It's time we confront our biases and rebuild trust with our community. The room remained silent, tension thick. Officer Lucas Wright sat in the second row, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. This was his chance to prove he was more than his past mistakes. As Elaine outlined the mandatory bias training and community outreach initiatives, murmurs rippled through the crowd. This is ridiculous, muttered Officer Greg Harmon, a veteran cop seated near the back. We're here to enforce the law, not hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Elaine's gaze snapped to him. Officer Harmon, this isn't about compromising enforcement. It's about ensuring our actions align with justice. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you take a hard look at why you wear that badge. The room fell silent. Wright glanced at Harmon, feeling a pang of recognition. He had once shared that same skepticism. The following week, the department's first bias training session took place in a sterile classroom. Elaine introduced the trainer, Dr. Olivia Grayson, a renowned psychologist specializing in systemic bias and cultural competence. Dr. Grayson began with a disarming smile. Let's get one thing straight. Bias is something we all have. The goal here isn't to shame anyone, but to understand how those biases affect our actions. She led the group through interactive exercises and role-playing scenarios. One activity involved officers identifying assumptions they made based on a series of photos. "Look at this image," Dr. Grayson said, projecting a picture of a young black man in a hoodie. "What's your first thought?" The room was uncomfortably quiet. Wright hesitated before speaking. "Honestly, I used to think trouble." Dr. Grayson nodded. "And now?" Wright swallowed hard. "Now, I see a kid who might just be walking home." Maya, sitting in as an observer, watched from the back of the room. For the first time, she saw genuine vulnerability in Wright. During a lunch break, Maya addressed the group. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that silenced the room. "I know, some of you might think this training is unnecessary or overkill," she began. "But let me tell you what it feels like to be on the other side of your assumptions." She recounted the humiliation of being handcuffed, her voice cracking as she described the stares from bystanders. That day wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a system that made those decisions feel justified. As she finished, a few officers clapped hesitantly. Wright was among them, his hands trembling slightly as he applauded. Elaine paired officers with community members for a ride-along program aimed at fostering understanding. Wright was assigned to Mrs. Lila Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. As they drove through familiar streets, Mrs. Jenkins spoke candidly. "Do you know how many times I've seen young men stopped just for walking down this block? It breaks my heart. Every time." Wright listened intently, her words piercing through his defenses. "I can't change what I've done," he admitted, "but I want to do better. For people like Maya, and for you." Back at the precinct, Officer Sarah Martinez reflected on her own role in Maya's arrest. She had stayed silent, too afraid to challenge Wright in the moment. Now, attending the training sessions, she realized the cost of her inaction. During a group discussion, Martinez spoke up. "I didn't step in when I should have," she confessed. "But I won't make that mistake again. We have a duty to each other, and to the people we serve." Her words resonated with Wright, who nodded in agreement. Not everyone embraced the changes. Officer Harmon continued to resist, openly mocking the training as a waste of time. But when he was paired with a local pastor during the ride-along program, something shifted. The pastor, a middle-aged black man named Reverend James, shared his own encounters with police. By the end of their shift, Harmon's tone softened. "Maybe I've been looking at this all wrong," he admitted quietly. Meanwhile, Maya began receiving messages from other precincts interested in replicating Elaine's reforms. One email from a small-town sheriff read, "Your story has inspired us to start a similar program. Thank you for being brave enough to share it." Wright volunteered to lead a workshop for newer recruits, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. Standing in front of the class, he admitted his past mistakes. "I'm not proud of what I did," he said, "but I've learned that being a good officer means more than following protocol. It means listening, really listening to the people we serve." One recruit raised her hand. "What changed for you?" "Maya Thompson," Wright said without hesitation. "She showed me what it means to be brave." Maya's blog posts about her experiences gained traction, sparking national conversations about police reform. She was invited to speak at a university panel on systemic bias, where her poise and authenticity left a lasting impression. After the event, a young attendee approached her. "Because of you, I'm thinking about studying law," she said. "I want to help make things better." Maya smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The chapter ends with a community event hosted by the precinct. Officers and residents gathered in the park, sharing food and stories. Wright stood with Maya near a mural painted by local artists, depicting a diverse group of people holding hands. The words "unity through understanding" were emblazoned across the top. "It's a start," Wright said quietly. "It's more than that," Maya replied, her voice filled with hope. "It's progress." The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers set up chairs, arranged a buffet table, and tested microphones for the evening's town hall. Captain Elaine Thompson stood at the center of the chaos, clipboard in hand, coordinating last-minute details. "This is our chance to show the community we're listening," she told Officer Sarah Martinez, who stood beside her. "But it's not just about appearances, it's about action." Maya walked in with Leah, her best friend, carrying a stack of printed flyers that read, "Reform in Action. Let's build a better future together." The event was the culmination of weeks of outreach and planning, bringing together police officers, activists, and residents to discuss racial bias and meaningful reform. By 7 p.m., the community center was filled with a wide range of attendees: local activists, students, business owners, and families. Some arrived with hopeful expressions, while others crossed their arms skeptically. Maya scanned the room, spotting Mrs. Lila Jenkins, who gave her a reassuring smile. Across the aisle sat Officer Greg Harmon, his face unreadable, and Wright, whose nervous energy was palpable. Elaine approached the podium as the crowd settled. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're here to address not only the challenges we face, but the solutions we can create together." Elaine introduced Maya as the first speaker, prompting murmurs from the crowd. Maya took a deep breath, clutching her notes. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maya Thompson. A few weeks ago, I was handcuffed on the side of the road for doing nothing wrong." A hush fell over the room. Maya described her experience, the fear, humiliation, and anger she felt that day. "But tonight isn't about reliving the pain," she continued. "It's about turning that pain into progress." She shared her hope for a future where people weren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, echoing the words of Martin Luther King Jr. The audience erupted in applause as Maya stepped back from the podium, her cheeks flushed with emotion. As the applause faded, Elaine invited Wright to speak next. He hesitated before standing, feeling the weight of every eye on him. "I'm not proud of why I'm here," he began, his voice low. "But I am proud to be part of what's happening tonight." He recounted his encounter with Maya, his voice trembling as he described the moment he realized his actions were wrong. "I made assumptions that day, assumptions based on prejudice, not facts, and those assumptions hurt Maya and this community." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Wright pressed on. "I can't undo what I did, but I can choose to be better. That's why I'm here. To listen, learn, and help rebuild the trust I broke." The floor was opened for questions, and hands shot up across the room. The moderator, a local pastor named Reverend James, called on attendees one by one. A young black man stood first. "Officer Wright, do you really think one apology can fix what you did?" Wright nodded solemnly. "No, I don't. But I believe actions speak louder than words, and I'm committed to proving that every day moving forward." An elderly white woman asked Maya, "How do you find the strength to forgive?" Maya smiled softly. "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means holding people accountable in a way that helps them grow. As the evening progressed, tensions began to ease. The dialogue became more collaborative, with residents sharing their concerns and officers offering insights into their challenges. Reverend James asked the room, "What can we do together to make our community safer and more inclusive?" Suggestions poured in. More police involvement in community events, monthly forums to maintain open communication, transparent reporting on complaints against officers. Elaine promised to implement these ideas, emphasizing the department's commitment to change. Near the end of the night, an unexpected voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Jenkins, I've seen more in my years than I care to admit," she said, her voice strong. "But tonight gives me hope. Maya, you remind me of the fighters of my generation. And Officer Wright. I see someone willing to change. That's what matters." Her words brought tears to many eyes, including Maya's. After the town hall, attendees were invited outside for the unveiling of a community mural. Painted by local artists, the mural depicted hands of all colors reaching toward a shared sun, with the words, "Unity through understanding." Maya and Wright stood side by side, their reflections mirrored in the vibrant paint. "It's beautiful," Maya whispered. Wright nodded. "It's a start." Elaine joined them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "It's more than that. It's a symbol of what we can achieve together." As the crowd dispersed, Maya and Elaine sat on a bench, watching families take photos in front of the mural. "Do you think this will make a difference?" Maya asked. Elaine smiled. "I know it will. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters." Maya rested her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The chapter ends with Maya writing a blog post, "What Unity Looks Like." She describes the town hall, the mural, and the small victories that give her hope. Her final words resonate deeply. Change starts with one conversation, one action, one moment of courage. Tonight, we proved that together, we're unstoppable. The morning after the town hall, Maya woke up to a barrage of notifications on her phone. Social media posts praising her speech were mixed with harsh comments, accusing her of exaggerating the incident. She scrolled through the comments, her chest tightening as she read, "She's just playing the victim card. This whole thing is blown out of proportion." Leah called moments later. "Maya, don't read the comments," she said firmly. "Focus on the people you've inspired. That's what matters." Despite Leah's advice, Maya couldn't shake the sting of criticism. "Why can't people see what this is really about?" she asked, her voice heavy with frustration. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Captain Elaine Thompson faced resistance from her own team. "I don't see why we need all this sensitivity training," Officer Greg Harmon muttered to a small group of colleagues. "We're not the bad guys here." Elaine overheard the comment and approached the group. "Greg, this isn't about pointing fingers," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's about ensuring we serve every member of our community with respect. If you have concerns, my door is open." Greg hesitated but nodded. After Elaine walked away, Officer Sarah Martinez pulled him aside. "She's right, you know," Sarah said softly. "What happened to Maya was wrong. We can't ignore that." Maya attended a student panel discussion at her high school, where she was invited to share her story. The auditorium was filled with classmates, teachers, and parents, many of whom looked at her with admiration. But not everyone was supportive. During the Q&A session, a student named Jason raised his hand. "Don't you think you're overreacting?" he asked bluntly. "The cop was just doing his job." Maya's heart raced, but she steadied herself. "Jason, it's not about one officer or one mistake. It's about the assumptions people make because of how I look. That's not okay. And it's something we all need to address. The audience erupted into applause, drowning out Jason's grumbled response. Officer Lucas Wright sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the newspaper headline, "A community divided. Can change heal the rift?" His wife, Rachel, placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "Lucas, you've been quiet since the town hall. What's on your mind?" "I'm trying," he said, after a long pause, "but it feels like no matter what I do, it's not enough." Rachel reached for his hand. "Change takes time, Lucas. The fact that you're trying means something. Keep going." Encouraged by her words, Wright resolved to confront the officers resisting reform. The next day, Wright joined a mandatory bias training session, led by a facilitator named Dr. Elena Grant. As Dr. Grant explained how unconscious bias affects decision-making, Greg scoffed. "This is just a bunch of buzzwords," Greg said under his breath. Wright, sitting nearby, turned to him. "Greg, do you really think what happened to Maya was okay?" Greg bristled. "I think she made a mountain out of a molehill. You're taking the heat for doing your job." Wright's voice was calm but firm. "I thought the same thing, until I realized how much harm I caused. If we can't see our mistakes, how can we be better?" The room fell silent as Greg avoided Wright's gaze, his expression conflicted. Leah invited Maya to a local youth activist meeting, where they discussed strategies for addressing systemic bias. "Maya, you're a natural leader," said Jordan Carter, the civil rights lawyer working with Elaine. "You have the ability to inspire real change." Maya hesitated. "I'm just a teenager. What can I really do?" Jordan smiled. "Age doesn't define impact. Your voice has already reached so many people. Keep using it." Bolstered by his encouragement, Maya agreed to help organize a youth-led march to support police reform. On a sunny Saturday morning, hundreds of people gathered in front of the community center, holding signs with messages like, "Justice for all. Unity, not division." Maya stood at the front of the crowd, holding a megaphone. "We're not here to tear anyone down," she said. "We're here to build something better for everyone." The march wound through the streets, passing the precinct where Elaine and Wright stood on the steps, watching with pride. "This is what progress looks like," Elaine said. Later that evening, Wright visited Elaine's office. "Captain, I want to thank you for pushing me," he said. Elaine raised an eyebrow. "You're thanking me for making your life harder." Wright chuckled. "I needed it. I've been having conversations I should have had years ago. With my family, my colleagues, even myself. I'm not the same person I was when this started." Elaine nodded. "That's growth, Lucas, and it's just the beginning." At the next precinct meeting, Greg stood up unexpectedly. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice hesitant. "I've been resistant to change because I didn't want to admit I was wrong. But I see now that this is about more than me. It's about doing what's right." The room erupted in quiet murmurs, but Elaine's expression softened. "Thank you, Greg. That takes courage." That night, Maya sat on her bed, journaling about the day's events. Her pen moved quickly as she wrote. "Change isn't easy. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often met with resistance. But every step forward matters, no matter how small. Today, I saw what's possible when we work together. Tomorrow, we keep going." As she closed her journal, Maya felt a sense of calm. She wasn't just surviving the aftermath of her experience. She was thriving, turning her pain into purpose. The morning of the NYPD's public diversity event dawned bright and crisp. A stage had been set up in the park, adorned with banners that read, Unity through understanding, building trust together. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers handed out flyers and attendees filled the seats. Maya, sitting in the front row, scanned the crowd and spotted familiar faces. Her best friend Leah, Officer Sarah Martinez, and even Greg Harmon, who had joined the event despite initial reluctance. On the stage, Captain Elaine Thompson stood beside Officer Lucas Wright, their expressions a mix of determination and optimism. This was a moment of reckoning for both of them, and they knew the stakes were high. The event began with speeches from local leaders, but the crowd came alive when Maya was introduced. "She's now just a survivor of bias," the MC said, "but a catalyst for change. Please welcome Maya Thompson." As Maya approached the podium, applause thundered around her. She paused to steady herself, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice strong but tinged with emotion. "A few months ago, I stood on the side of the road, handcuffed and humiliated because of an assumption. Today I stand before you, not as a victim, but as a voice for change." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," Maya continued. "But it's not just about blame. It's about growth. Together, we can build a community where no one has to feel the fear I felt that day." Her speech ended with a standing ovation. Maya stepped back, her confidence soaring as the crowd's energy buoyed her. The applause had barely faded when Officer Wright took the stage. He glanced nervously at the audience, then at Maya, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm not proud of the man I was that day," Wright began, his voice wavering. "But I'm here to tell you that change is possible. Maya showed me that." He turned to her, his expression earnest. "Maya, I want to thank you for your courage, your strength, and your willingness to forgive. You didn't just change me. You inspired me." Wright held up a plaque. "On behalf of the NYPD, it's my honor to present Maya Thompson with this award for outstanding courage and leadership." Maya accepted the plaque, her hands trembling as the crowd erupted into applause once again. The moment felt surreal, a testament to how far they had all come. After the speeches, the event moved to a large wall near the park. Covered in a massive white sheet, it hid the mural that the community had been working on for weeks. Maya stood with Elaine Wright and local artist Rachel Daniels as the sheet was pulled away. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they took in the artwork. The mural depicted people of all races and ages, their hands linked in unity. At the center, Maya was portrayed standing tall, her face a beacon of hope. Above her, bold letters proclaimed, "Unity through understanding." Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she stared at the mural. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Rachel stepped forward. "This is for everyone who believes in a better future," she said, "but especially for Maya, who reminded us that change starts with a single voice." Throughout the afternoon, the park buzzed with activity. Booths were set up for community discussions, offering resources on racial equity and police reform. At one booth, Maya and Leah spoke with attendees about the youth advisory council they were forming. "I'm interested," said a young boy named Jaden, clutching a flyer. "I want to help make things better." Maya smiled, seeing herself in his wide-eyed determination. "You're already making a difference just by being here," she said. Meanwhile, Wright manned a booth on bias training, sharing his story with attendees. "It's not easy to admit your mistakes," he told a group of young officers, "but it's the first step toward being better." As the sun began to set, Elaine and Maya walked to the edge of the park, away from the crowd. They sat on a bench overlooking the mural. You've come a long way, Maya, Elaine said, her voice filled with pride. Maya looked at her mother, tears glistening in her eyes. I couldn't have done it without you. Elaine shook her head. This was all you. You took something painful and turned it into something powerful. That's real strength. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the journey behind them and the promise of the future ahead. The event ended with a candlelight vigil. Hundreds of people held candles aloft, their flames flickering against the night sky. Maya stood beside Elaine and Wright, her heart full, as she listened to the crowd sing a hymn of unity. As the final notes faded, Elaine turned to the crowd. This is just the beginning, she said. Together, we will continue to grow, to learn, and to build a community where everyone feels seen and valued. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing into the night. That night, as Maya lay in bed, she stared at the plaque on her nightstand. It wasn't just a symbol of recognition. It was a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. She opened her journal and wrote, "Today, I saw what hope looks like. It's not perfect and it's not easy, but it's real. And it's ours." Maya stood in her bedroom, surrounded by packed boxes and open suitcases. The room felt bittersweet, a mix of her past and the promise of her future. Her acceptance letter to Columbia University sat proudly on her desk, a reminder of the dreams that had driven her forward. Elaine entered, carrying a cup of tea. "Ready for the big day?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with emotion. Maya nodded. "Almost. It's strange to think I'm leaving all this behind." Elaine smiled. "You're not leaving it behind. You're carrying it with you. Every lesson, every moment. It's part of who you are." As they shared a quiet moment, Maya felt a surge of gratitude for her mother's unwavering support. The next morning, Maya and Elaine joined the community at the park for the official unveiling of the mural. Despite having seen it before, Maya felt a swell of pride as she stood before the artwork. Rachel Daniels, the artist, stepped forward to address the crowd. "This mural represents more than just a story. It's a vision of what we can achieve together. It's about resilience, unity, and the power of a single voice to inspire change." Maya was invited to cut the ribbon. As she did, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Afterward, Maya posed for photos with neighbors, activists, and police officers. She noticed Officer Wright, standing quietly near the edge of the crowd, his expression contemplative. Later, Maya found herself in a quiet corner of the park, where Wright was standing by himself. She approached him cautiously. "Officer Wright," she began, her tone neutral. He turned, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Maya, it's good to see you." She nodded. "How are you holding up?" Wright sighed. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm learning. Every day I remind myself that change isn't comfortable, but it's necessary." Maya studied him for a moment. "You've come a long way," she said finally. "So have you," he replied. "You've shown more strength and grace than I ever thought possible." For the first time, Maya felt a sense of closure. "Thank you," she said simply. And they shook hands, a gesture of reconciliation and mutual respect. As the day unfolded, the park buzzed with activities. Booths highlighted community programs, including the Youth Advisory Council Maya had helped establish. Leah, ever the supportive friend, manned a booth with Maya. "Look at all these kids signing up," Leah said, beaming. "You're really making a difference." Maya smiled. "We all are. It's not just me." Nearby, Elaine and Sarah Martinez led a discussion on police-community relations. Sarah spoke openly about the challenges of confronting biases within the department. earning respect from the audience. Elaine addressed the crowd with confidence. We're not just talking about change, we're living it. This is just the beginning of a better future for all of us. That evening, Maya and Elaine returned home, exhausted but content. They sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their neighborhood. You know, Elaine said, breaking the silence, when this all started, I was terrified, not just for you, but for what it meant for our community. Maya nodded. It felt like everything was falling apart. But now, I don't know. It feels like we're building something stronger. Elaine reached for her daughter's hand. You've been a big part of that. Never forget how much power your voice has. Maya smiled. I learned from the best. The next morning, the day of Maya's move to Colombia arrived. The car was packed, and Elaine double-checked the route on her phone. Don't forget to call me when you get there, Elaine said, her voice tinged with both excitement and sadness. I will, Maya promised, hugging her mother tightly. As they drove through the neighborhood one last time, Maya noticed the mural in the distance. It was a symbol of everything they had endured and achieved, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could shine through. At Columbia, Maya settled into her dorm, her excitement mingled with nerves. That evening, she sat by the window, overlooking the bustling city below. She opened her journal, the one she had started during her ordeal, and began to write. This is the start of something new. I'm not the same person I was a few months ago, and that's a good thing. I've learned that change is hard, but it's worth it. And now, it's my turn to keep making a difference. She closed the journal, her resolve stronger than ever. Back in the neighborhood, the mural became a gathering place for the community. Kids played near it, families took photos, and visitors stopped to admire its message. Elaine walked by one evening, her heart swelling with pride. She knew the journey wasn't over, but the progress they had made was undeniable. As the sun set, the words on the mural seemed to glow, unity through understanding. And in that moment, Elaine knew that their story had become something bigger than them, a beacon of hope for generations to come. As Maya steps forward into her new journey, the mural in her community stands tall, a reminder of resilience, hope, and the power of a single voice to spark change. Her story is proof that even in the face of adversity, we can all make a difference by standing up for what's right. Now, it's your turn. What would you have done if you were in Maya's shoes? Or if you were Officer Wright, realizing the weight of your mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, there's so much more to come. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you never miss a moment. Join us next time for another powerful story that will inspire you, challenge you, and remind you of the strength we all carry within us. See you in the next chapter.